All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first the infant, mewling and puking in his nurse's arms. Then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and his shining morning face, crawling like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow. Then the soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, with full round belly and full capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts to the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice now turning again to childish treble, and so he pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all, that ends this strange, eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Hello everyone, Shakespeare. I am so glad to be here, and to all of you who are streaming to watch tonight, I'm thrilled. You know, I'll just tell you a little background story before I bring Paul in. I grew up in North Dakota, in a small cattle town in the western part of the state, 13,000 people, and I don't mean to be in any way critical of it, but I never heard language used there as it can be used. It was a town that Sinclair Lewis might have wished to satirize. People said things like, long time no see, or working hard or hardly working, or what's it going to take for me to get you into a new car here today? Or the worst, one time I was at the local Elks Lodge with my family. As I went into the men's room, and the man at the urinal beside me said, you know, if you shake it more than 3 times, you're playing with it. That was the status of the English language in western North Dakota. I'm serious. The best use of language I heard there was in church when someone read verses from the King James translation of the Bible. I didn't know any better. I had no Shakespeare in school. Not once. Not even Julius Caesar. I went off to the University of Vanderbilt in Nashville, and part of the I was going to be a journalist, and part of the distribution requirements were to take a course in English. So I took Introduction to English Drama. And the professor was a wonderful man named Bernard Gutenberg, and he had a Roman nose. And he looked down that nose at us and treated us as if we were morons, which of course we were. I loved him. He had the precise hauteur and arrogance that you want in your first grade English professor. And we read this anthology of verse. So we read, of course, Oedipus Rex, and then we read Antigone, and then we read Everyman. And then he said, well, on Monday, I want you to have read Hamlet. This was my first introduction to Shakespeare. And I was on the 5th floor of the library there at Vanderbilt and reading the Pelican paperback edition of Hamlet. And about an hour in, something happened that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I remember words that I had never heard of before, zounds, and I marry, there it is, and paragon, and quintessence, and words you would never hear in the state of North Dakota. Even to this day, I'm sorry to say. And then I came upon this passage. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? I was hooked. I had not been aware that language could reach this height. Nothing had prepared me for this moment. And I remember I actually didn't sleep that night. As you probably know, in Nashville, there's a full-scale replica of the Parthenon. I went to Centennial Park and walked around that park all night thinking, why has my life not brought me to this sooner? And so I changed my major to English and transferred to the University of Minnesota, where I had the greatest Shakespeare professor of my life, a man named Thomas Clayton. I took 3 or 4 courses from him. And then I was lucky enough to study at Oxford University for 4 years in England, and that was just like a full immersion in the Shakespearean world. I studied 17th century literature, so John Donne and Andrew Marvell and John Milton and George Herbert and so on, but above all, Shakespeare. And during that time, at Oxford, there are long vacations. I went to Stratford alone and got a little inexpensive bed and breakfast, and over a 10-day period, I saw at least 12 Shakespeare plays, including Hamlet 4 times. I was in love with Hamlet and in love with a man named Michael Pennington, who was, I think, the best Hamlet I've ever seen live, and he was later famous for his King Lear in Brooklyn. And this was my life for a long time. This was my life. Then roads diverged, and I wound up moving sort of more into history and the larger humanities, but that's neither here nor there. So a number of years ago, wanting to get back to my roots, I called my friend Paul Lassico in Norfolk. I've done many programs there. I've done Jefferson there, and I've done J. Robert Oppenheimer there, and Meriwether Lewis there, and so on. We did a play, My Head and My Heart, based on Jefferson's love letter to Maria Cosway. I did a comedy album, if you can imagine that. Kind of sort of William Shatner in the late years, kind of a feel, you know. And I have about a garage full of copies, if you would like one. And then I called him up about 4 years ago, and I said, Paul, you've never said no to me. What I would really like to do is to come and perform Hamlet. And Paul said, you're sort of closer to the King Lear phase of your life, which I thought was mean and low. But he said, I'll tell you what, let's do one scene. Let's do one scene. So we chose Act 5, Scene 1, the famous graveyard scene in Hamlet. And I thought, well, now I'd better prepare. So I bought some costumes and so on. I knew I needed an earring. You can't really do Shakespeare without an earring. But I live in North Dakota. And North Dakota is a red state where we still believe in binary gender questions and so on. And they're a little rough on the arts. And so I didn't know how to do this. I was in my 60s. And so I thought the only way to get a pierced ear is at Claire's, you know, in the mall. Oh, it gets much worse. So I did not want to go to Claire's in Bismarck for reasons you might understand. So I actually drove 200 miles to Fargo. And at the West Acres Mall, I went into Claire's. You've been in those, I know. And I felt absolutely out of place. I went up and I said, I'd like to get my ear pierced. And they make you go through a whole rigmarole of, you know, you have to sign sheets and you have to be consulted and you have to be told about proper care and so on. And I just want to just pierce my ear. So then they take you over and you actually kind of sit on a throne. And I'm there, and they're about to do this, and suddenly I see I'm surrounded by about 9 12-year-old girls. And they're looking at me like, ugh. And so I'm as embarrassed as you can be, just get it over with. And then this mother in her 40s comes up to me and says, sir, you know, you're pretty old to be having a midlife crisis. So, you know, the course of true love never did run smooth. But then we did it, and it was so much fun and so successful that we wanted to do it here. So, without any further ado, I want to bring out somebody that I have the deepest respect for Paul Lassico of Norfolk, Virginia. Paul. So, Paul, all the world's a stage. Let's do this. You know, when I do retreats in Laxaw Lodge. I've recently taken groups to England, and we go to the Globe Theatre, and we go to Stratford, and we see a number of plays and so on. This last summer, I went to Cedar City, Utah, saw a fabulous production of The Taming of the Shrew. Was in Ashland and saw a great production of Macbeth. Then I went to the Globe and saw Taming of the Shrew, and I have to say, it wasn't as good as in Utah, which is pretty interesting. I don't think they would like that much at the Globe, but it was a great production. But the question I get asked every time I do a retreat or a class is, did the people of Shakespeare's time understand this stuff? Could they, when they're sitting in the Globe Theatre, could they understand what was going on stage? Because it's so fast, and this was a time of great effervescence in the English language. Thousands of words were coming in. This was an age of discovery, and so the English language was exploding, and Shakespeare, more than anybody else, was taking advantage of that. You know, Shakespeare has the largest vocabulary of any writer in English, 20,000 words. John Milton is about 7,000, the most learned of all English poets. And so Shakespeare is difficult because there's so much that we no longer have in our vocabulary. And so I say to them, yes and no. That the people in the Elizabethan, at the Globe in 1600 say, yeah, they understood most of it. But I wanted to start there. So how did it sound? English was spoken differently then from what it is today. And I've asked you if you would be willing to give the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, one of his early plays, 1595-96, and first give it in modern English. It's very short, and then we'll hear it in Elizabethan. So give us the prologue in modern English.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife.
So simple enough. Star-crossed lovers, Hatfields and the McCoys at each other's throats. These lovers come together, it ends in death. Mm-hmm. There's a pun. These two lovers take their life, so they take their life from this feud, but they also, in the end, take their lives. And so, you know, as you know, Shakespeare loves a pun. And the great Samuel Johnson, one of the greatest Shakespeare critics of all time, said, "A pun for Shakespeare is the fatal Cleopatra for which he lost the world and was content to lose it." He never passes up a pun, no matter if it's a tragedy, a comedy, a history. Shakespeare never comes near a word that can be punned, especially a sexual pun, without grabbing it. And so in the 19th century, an Englishman named Thomas Bowdler was appalled by this because he thought that Shakespeare, therefore, is not available to families and to young women. And so he went through all of the 37 plays and took out all of the sexual innuendo. That led to what's called the family Shakespeare. And he also then gave a word to the English language, Bowdlerize. You know, he was condemned for this. Who meddles with Shakespeare? And so when we say someone has Bowdlerized a text, we mean they've done precisely what Bowdler did in the 19th century. So with that in mind, give us the first line of the prologue in Elizabethan.
Two households, both alike in dignity.
All right. Two households, both alike in dignity. Mm-hmm. All right. So now, as best as you can, give us the full prologue in Elizabethan pronunciation.
Certainly. Two households, both alike in dignity, in far Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal lines of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strafe.
Okay, so pretty understandable, but just a few lines. I understand that some production companies actually attempt to do a complete play in Elizabethan pronunciation. That must be almost impossible to follow.
It may, but luckily, for instance, if you do Romeo and Juliet in what we call OP, original pronunciation, everybody already knows the story, right? So it's a lot easier to follow along then. And most of the companies that do that are the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Globe Theatre, the very, very best of the best. And actors of that caliber, directors of that caliber, they can tell a story probably without any words. So I think that helps it propel it along. And the language, once you get a little used to it, is not that hard to understand.
It sounded a little bit like something out of Pirates of the Caribbean.
There's a lot of hard R's.
Give it to us one more time.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our seine. From ancient grudge, break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal lines of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife.
Excellent, thank you. So, all right, we'll stick with more modern pronunciation here. So, one thing that I really recommend, we're living in the reason I do this program, the reason we do this program, is that we're living in the best time to understand and have a run at Shakespeare ever, except the Elizabethan age. We have resources today that 50 years ago didn't exist. Not only do we have extraordinary editions of Shakespeare, the Pelican Shakespeare, the Riverside Shakespeare, the Yale Shakespeare, the Oxford Shakespeare, the Norton Shakespeare, the Arden Shakespeare, with great introductions and wonderful annotations. And we have films. Kenneth Branagh has done 6 of them, amongst the best adaptations of Shakespeare ever. And when you see Shakespeare, so let's take As You Like It or Othello, you see it on a stage, you're in row 15 and you're a long way and you can't really, you're just trying to keep up. But when you see it on film, when the camera comes this close to Othello, somehow it makes it so much easier to follow the language. And you're almost never mystified when you're watching a Branagh version or a Lord Olivier version or Ian McKellen. That's the genius of film. And of course, with film, you can push pause and look up something or go back and rewind it. So that's a resource. Remember when some of you were old enough to remember being in high school or college when your English teacher or professor would turn on a 16 millimeter print of Hamlet. You'd hear that sprocket and it often would melt. But, it was just, these were archival. These were as if the camera were in the corner of the theater and you couldn't really even see. We're living in the great age of film adaptations, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the BBC, and of course, Kenneth Branagh. Plus online, we have almost an infinite number of resources. Remember when you were in school, back at the University of Minnesota, and you would be reading something that was very difficult, and then you would go to the bookstore, and you would look around furtively, and go to the Cliff's Notes, and pull a copy, and hoping that no one saw you of any importance. It was like going into a porn shop, and you felt guilt, and you were made to feel guilt. Today online, the resources are just infinite. Sparks Notes, Cliff's Notes, there are hundreds of them. And sites where you can see recreations of the Globe Theatre. You could print it out and make a cardboard cutout of it. There are sites on the murders and the suicides in Shakespeare, the performance history of every single play. We have resources that beggar anything in 1970. And just for those of you who want to make a run at Shakespeare, and I hope you will, or a new run, I highly recommend this series called No Fear Shakespeare, because on the left-hand page, it's the actual text, and on the right-hand page, it's a paraphrase. So oftentimes you don't really even know what's going on. You read the passage and you have nothing. But if you go to the right-hand page, it gives you a paraphrase. Now, the paraphrases are pretty prosaic, so we're going to do to be or not to be here in a moment. This is the paraphrase of the first lines of that great soliloquy. The question is it better to be alive or dead? Is it nobler to put up with all the nasty things that luck throws your way? or to fight against all those troubles by simply putting an end to them once and for all. Dying, sleeping, that's all dying is. So it's not poetry. It is not poetry, but it's reliable. And once you've then figured out what the heck is going on, you can go back to the original passage and suddenly think it's like a padlock that so the tumblers fall into place, and suddenly you're able to get it. So this is a really good resource. And if you're listening to it at the same time or watching a fine film adaptation, you can really come to terms with Shakespeare in a wonderful way. So the intimidation factor has largely disappeared. Great resources. All right, so let's do To Be or Not to Be. And I want you to answer some questions. All right, so I'll just do it in a kind of slightly formal way. This is, after all, the most famous passage in all of Shakespeare. Everyone knows of it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns which patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue and resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. All right, that's in a slightly formal way. So what's going on here? I won't read the paraphrase. What's going on here? Hamlet is miserable. We all know that. His mother has remarried almost instantly after the death of his father. And he has to, she's in her 40s probably, and he has to come to terms with the fact that his mother is still sexually active, and this is driving him nuts. I don't know if you remember when you first realized that your parents did it, but for most of it, that is not a pleasant moment. And his father died suddenly and mysteriously in the garden. They say a serpent stung him when he was napping. Hamlet's pretty sure that can't be true. And his mother married Claudius, his uncle, who's nothing like his father. He's pathetic compared to his father. And Hamlet is just completely coming apart over this, all of this together. And so in this speech he says, if life is so miserable that if you could flip a switch and just be gone, period, nothing, annihilation, the big sleep, a rational person would do it. But he says, wait a minute, sleep can mean dream, and dream can mean great dream or nightmare. And so the fact that we don't just annihilate, but there is some sort of afterlife, it can go either way, that makes us cowards because we're afraid to make that gamble. Maybe however awful our lives are, it's worse on the other side. So we continue to bear fardels and put up with all the crap because it's not a risk we're willing to take. Now, that's not how we think in the 21st century. It's certainly not in Vail. We're not miserable in that way. But think of what that era was. There was no hygiene. There was no antibiotics. The average life expectancy was about 35. Of children born into the world, at least a third, sometimes a half, died of infant diseases. The mother often died in childbirth. There were no sewage systems. People simply threw their sewage into the gutters. There was no pavement. There were no streetlights. There were no police. It was a nightmare world, and plagues and diseases were running through, including the Black Plague and the bubonic plague, and then syphilis came from the New World, presumably. And so this was a time when human misery was infinitely more than it can be in the first world today. And so Hamlet's pessimism, his desire to annihilate himself, makes more sense then than it would today. All right, so that's the paraphrase. Now, here's my question for you. This is the most famous speech in Shakespeare. It's the most famous soliloquy. Everybody knows of it. Every actor has watched it a gazillion times, has watched Lord Olivier do it. And the actor comes to this, and he, or sometimes she, has to decide what to do. Because you don't want to do it as a cliche. It's that common. The actor wants to make sure that the audience sees Hamlet actually thinking on his feet. In other words, we see it as a great set piece, but it's not a set piece for Hamlet. For Hamlet, he's puzzling this stuff in live action. And so the actor has to make that come alive, and yet the actor lives in the shadow of Olivier and the shadow of Richard Burton and the shadow of everyone who's ever done this. How does the actor approach this without being completely neurotic about it?
Standing up in front of people and giving a speech like that everybody knows, that everybody's heard 100 times, it's terrifying, or can be. I approach a character for a famous speech, like To Be or Not to Be, as I approach any other character. I find places in myself that echo the emotions that are in that text. During my training in college, I was taught, don't become the character. Get the character to become you.
Oh, wait. Don't become King Lear. Don't become Othello. Don't become Iago. Don't become Festi. Make them become you. Explain.
Find echoes of the character in yourself and capitalize on those. Through the rehearsal process, the true character that is the play will emerge. But, again, my training, you get 3 actors in a room and ask them, how you develop characters, they're going to give you like 5 answers. But, for my part, I access what is called sense memory. It's a term from Stanislavski's method acting. And I think back upon times that, while I've never contemplated suicide, thankfully, I have had very sad times in my life. I've experienced grief. I've experienced great joy. I've experienced longing. And apply those to your character, and the two eventually merge.
If you know what you're doing. When I'm doing it, I'm just trying not to faint. I'm just trying to make sure I get it out without flubbing it. I'm just trying to make sense. So when I think about it, I think, well, number one, my duty is to convey Shakespeare's sense to the audience. So I'm going to play it as straight as I can in that respect. Then I realize that I need to go through it line by line, moment by moment, to meditate it, to say it 1,000,000 times, to say it in front of others, and try to figure out where the pauses are, where the emphasis should be, what's really going on here. But I also feel, and this is where I might disagree with many in our time, and I'm not an actor, I'm just a scholar, but I think we owe it to Shakespeare to do it as Shakespeare wanted us to do it. And many times when I see these great speeches, Portia, the quality of mercy is not strained, or Othello, whenever he's talking about his great travels in Africa, these actors come to it, and I think that they're so unwilling to be yet another person doing that speech that they swallow it, that they distort it, that they get in the way of it. They actually get in the way of that speech. And I just want to stand up and say, don't. Just deliver it, for goodness sakes. It may not be the best performance ever, but just deliver it, so at least we get what Shakespeare intended. So what's our duty to Shakespeare when we perform?
I think it's the same duty we have to pretty much any other playwright. As I was saying, my process is to let the character become me to a point. That way, my acting, I hope, is not artificial. It's not, I don't go into thinking, how can I do this speech differently than everybody else has done it? I just find the emotions in myself that drive the inflection, drive the speech, drive the meaning. And so my answer in short is be genuine. Don't act. Never act. Just find yourself in the text, in the action.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So far, so good. He's pondering. What should I do here? To die, to sleep, hey, sleep, no more. Sleep's annihilation. When you go to sleep at night, you leave your troubles behind for 6 hours or 7 hours. And then he says, "'Tis a consummation devoutly to wish," just to click off the switch. Then he repeats, yeah, okay, to die, to sleep, and then it's, ew, perchance to dream. And then he realizes that's the problem. That's where it hurts. That's where he says, oh, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. And then he lists all the things that would make us want to commit suicide. The oppressor's wrong, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, all the things that we have to put up with all the time. When he himself might his quietus make, a bodkin was like a long needle pin, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Then he goes on, who would fardels bear? That's like lifting bales of hay. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, and then an aside, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. We don't know what's after death because no one's ever come back to tell us anything about it. Puzzles the will. Now we're all confused about what to do, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus, conscience, thinking too much about it, and that's, of course, Hamlet, thinking too much about everything. Thus, conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution, of our desire to do something, to act, to face our lives, to stop it, to get in the way of all the crap we have to put up with. Thus, conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied. I love that word, sicklied o'er, with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Do you have thoughts about how to do this? It's hard. It's such a glorious piece. It's one of the central things that everybody who has literature in them knows about. And yet it's critical to the play, right?
It is. And it's one of the speeches that, fledgling actors cut their teeth on. The speech is magnificent, and that's about all I can say about it. It encompasses the existentialism of Shakespeare. It poses life's great questions. I get a chill up my spine every time I hear it.
Right now you did?
Yes.
I don't think so. All right. So
I do.
But it can be done so much better than what I have done. So you talked about existential. Here's what's so interesting to me about Shakespeare. One of the many, 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 many things. He's writing in 1600. 1600, just a few years before Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. 1603, Giordano Bruno in Rome was burned at the stake for believing in a plurality of worlds. In Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, one day it would be King Lear or Hamlet, the next day bear baiting or cockfighting. This was a very, very different time. And Shakespeare is a man of his times. He's a man of the high English Renaissance. And yet he has certain moments, I can think of 3 of them, this moment, The scene we're going to perform at the end this evening, Act 5, Scene 1, the famous graveyard scene of Hamlet. And then the end of Macbeth, the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. And so I'm going to do it first in my lackluster way, and then I want you to do it the way it needs to be done. So Macbeth is up against it. He's about to die. His wife has committed suicide. This news comes to him just about the time he's going to fight in the last battle of his life. And they say, oh, your wife is dead. And he says, she should have died tomorrow. And tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now do it the way it needs to be done.
It was pretty good. I could just leave and it'd be fine.
No, come on.
There are many, many, many ways to perform this speech, and they're all perfectly valid. I've seen people do it with utter cynicism. I've seen people deliver it very, very flat. In my mind, Macbeth arrives at this point after doing horrible things to gain and maintain power.
Killing the legitimate king.
Exactly, regicide.
Right.
And there's plenty of room in the text that implies that he is remorseful. And so here Macbeth is, facing a battle that he knows he's not going to win. He will not survive. A servant comes on and tells him his wife is dead. Macbeth responds, she should have died henceforth. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creep in its petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays but light fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. 'Tis a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
So, all right, thank you, that's lovely. Much more dramatic than my little prosaic approach to it. So what's going on here? All right, so this is a play about a swashbuckling set of murders and duels and prophecies and the witches and so on. Is this a dagger I see before me? This is justly famous lines in this play. And it sounds like a history play, the thing that Shakespeare was a past master at this. And suddenly at the end, we have this kind of existentialist moment that you might expect in Samuel Beckett or Pinter or Eugene Ionesco. Suddenly it's like Camus is helping Shakespeare write the scene. So what's going on here? Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. This is a really deep sense of the futility of human activity. Where does this come from? This is Shakespeare. Where does this come from?
It's as nihilistic as Shakespeare gets, and no question about it. But where does it come from? I think that kind of despair is within all of us at some point or another. What does life really mean?
Nothing.
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 Well, at times that's what you might tell yourself after suffering a huge loss like the death of your wife and the realization that everything you've done up to that point has been for nothing. It's a universal speech. Everybody feels that way one time or another.
Do you remember when you first read this or first saw this and you're moving along and the witches and the Duncan and all the murders and so on and you're thinking, yeah, okay, I get this. This is interesting. And then suddenly, bang, this speech. Do you remember the feeling that you had, like you have to get up out of your chair? You just can't even believe that anyone ever wrote this, particularly someone 500 years ago?
What I thought is, I want to do that speech one of these days. And luckily, I'm able to do it tonight, thanks to Clay and to you. Again, it is the resolution of Macbeth. It is the place that he arrives through his own actions. You know, everything he's done was futile. His life is over, and it meant nothing.
No, I've read a lot of Elizabethan drama, and some of it is great. Christopher Marlowe, Dr. Faustus, and his many other extraordinary plays, The Jew of Malta. But there's nothing like this. I've read Ben Jonson's Comedies and Tragedies. There's nothing like this. So, you know, there's so much genius in Shakespeare that it has led critics to think it couldn't have been Shakespeare. Here's this guy from a provincial market town on the Avon River who had a grammar school education, who didn't go to Cambridge or Oxford or any university, who came up to London, and he started in the theater by holding the horses of noblemen who were coming to see other plays, and then he became a small actor, and then he invested in the company, and then he became a playwright, and he wrote these plays. It's still, for me, impossible to understand how this individual could write that scene, because it seems to transcend drama.
Personally, I don't care who wrote it.
That's not my question. My question is, I'm not saying this is Francis Bacon or the Earl of Oxford or Queen Elizabeth or a committee. That's an interesting rabbit hole to go down for the rest of your life if you want to. There are thousands of books written trying to prove that Shakespeare couldn't have been Shakespeare. I don't care one way or the other about this. We have the play. What I'm trying to ask you is, how do you skip from swordplay and out, brief candle? How do you get to this moment where suddenly everything just kind of opens up into an existential moment? Where's the genius coming from? We don't know, of course.
We don't know.
I'm asking you impossible questions, but you're supposed to be able to answer it.
If I understand the question correctly, how do you transition from the swordplay, the comic moments, and arrive at a moment like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? It's through the rehearsal process. It's through exploration, trial and error, studying the text. I'm not above getting on YouTube and seeing how other actors did it. It's a process that really never ends, especially with Shakespeare, because there's just so much there. You can keep digging and digging and digging into one line, and just more and more comes out.
All right, so let me just ask one last question about this. He says she should have died tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. So that triple repetition. Shakespeare does that for a purpose. In a number of his tragedies, he repeats a key word. In King Lear, for example, when Lear brings Cordelia out at the end and says, "Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life and now no breath at all?" He says, "You'll come no more. Never, 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 never." What's going on in these repetitions?
Well, those two are extremely similar. Never, never, never. It's the fact that that person is gone, never to return. And tomorrow, tomorrow, and tomorrow, they're all going to be as futile as the last. One day after another, void of meaning.
So, as I understand it, King Lear is trying to come to terms with the fact of never. Cordelia is never coming back. One minute she's alive, now she's dead forever. And so he's thinking, she'll not be back never. And then, oh, never. And it's not just Shakespeare milking the term, it's Lear trying to come to terms with what never means when you're talking about someone you love desperately.
True. One of the challenges of an actor in these repetitions that Shakespeare sets up is finding a way to say these three words differently, or not. And those, I've struggled with those three words, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, probably as much as the rest of the speech combined. It's tough stuff. And again, all I can do is try not to think about it too much and go within, rely on my emotions that this inspires, rely on the similar thoughts that I've had in my life, and try to bring it out organically rather than just impose something.
So what's the role of the director? So I'm your actor, and I'm going to say never, 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 never. What's the role? I've been thinking about this. We've had lots of meetings behind the scenes. We might even have brought in a Shakespeare scholar to help us think about it. We've consulted other performances and so on. And I come in, and you say, do it. And I say, never, 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 never. Now direct me. You have to, now you see what I want to do with it. You probably think, no, this can be better.
I believe that at its finest, a director is merely an advocate for the audience. All that person should do is make sure the audience gets it. And so I would probably turn to you and I would say, what are you feeling? What are you thinking about? When did you experience these emotions yourself? Again, go within. And again, a lot of people are going to disagree with me about this. Method acting, in many ways, it's been discredited. It's supposed to be psychologically harmful for the actor, perhaps. I wouldn't call myself a method actor, but I kind of go down that road. But again, finding the character within you, finding a way to make that character be you until they merge and come forth and are genuine.
So I think we need to do our performance of Act 5, Scene 1 here in a moment. But before, I want to do one more speech because I just love it, and it's in one of my favorite plays, and it's from Richard II. So Richard II was a weak and dissolute king, and so he's removed, he's deposed, and he realizes once he's been decrowned that he failed to live up to the expectations of a king, and therefore, in some sense, he deserved it. And he says one of the great lines, and this is why I love Shakespeare so much, because Shakespeare can pack so much into a single sentence. And I've thought of this a million times at the 11th hour when I'm trying to do something. Richard says, I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. Man, it doesn't get better than that, does it, Paul? I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. That's the poetry of it. And this paraphrase, No Fear Shakespeare, would be like, I wasted a lot of time, and now my time's running out. Well, that's the sense of it, but the way Shakespeare can find not only the iambic pentameter, I wasted time, and now doth time waste me, but also take a small number of words and play on that. It's like when Othello is about to murder his wife Desdemona, and he doesn't want to do it and see what he's doing, so he wants to turn off the lantern before he kills her. And he says, put out the light, and then put out the light. So put out the light, turn the lights off, and then put out the light of her existence. This is Shakespeare at his best, and this is the sense of the genius of Shakespeare. So this is the speech that Richard gives, and I hope I don't, you can direct me. But so people are trying to comfort him now that he's been deposed. And he's a very self-pitying fellow, but beautifully poetic. And this is like the first time Shakespeare really reaches this level of poetic grandeur. It's pretty early in his career as a playwright. And Richard says, of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves and worms and epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and make our wills, and yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to this ground? Our lives, our lands, and all our Bolingbroke's, and nothing can we call our own save death, and that small portion of the barren earth which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the men they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the sacred head of a king holds death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with vain and self-conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable. And humored thus, death comes at last, and with a little pin bores through the castle wall, and farewell, king. Cover your heads and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Put aside all tradition, form, respect, and ceremonial duty. For you have but mistook me all this while. I feed with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Magnificent, isn't it? Absolutely magnificent. And just keep in mind, Shakespeare has to be compared to sort of a Hollywood scriptwriter. He doesn't invent any stories. He's almost a plagiarist. Well, he is, and they didn't really have a concept of plagiarism then, but he's ruthlessly stealing stories and plot lines from everything that he can get his hands on. He's not trying to invent much except language. And once he has it, he ruthlessly milks whatever the source is, sometimes quoting whole sections of Plutarch. And then when it's done, when the play was done, he didn't own the script. The script now belongs to the company. And Shakespeare made no effort to save his plays. When he was done, it's like a B Hollywood movie. Toss the script in the bin and move on. If it hadn't been for several friends of his after his death that collected the first folio, 18 of his most important plays would never have seen the light because he couldn't be bothered to save them. What he wanted to be remembered for was his two long narrative poems, The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, which he wrote during one of the plagues. He made no effort to capitalize on the best drama in the English language. He wasn't even that fond of his 156 sonnets. And so then you think, well, luckily his friends preserved these texts. But Shakespeare retired in 1611, went home to Stratford and just got in his Barcalounger and sat out for the rest of his life. It's so interesting, isn't it, that Ben Jonson published his works in a pompous gilded edition. Shakespeare said, I wrote that, that's Hamlet, move on. Fascinating. Paul, why don't you go and get ready? I'll say a little bit about Hamlet, and then we will do Act 5, Scene 1 in about 7 or 8 minutes.
We shall.
All right, let's start. See you in a minute. All right, so, thank you. I hope you're finding this interesting. We sure are. But that doesn't necessarily mean much. So Hamlet. In the first scene, there's a group of guards up on the battlements, and there's some sense of a national security crisis in Denmark. And the ghost of Hamlet Sr. appears. And they say, we better get Hamlet here because he's going to want to see this. So they go get Hamlet, and Hamlet the next night is out there with them. And he has an encounter with his father's ghost. And Hamlet Sr. says, look, that whole thing about me dying of a serpent thing, that's crap. The person who did it is now sleeping with your mother, Hamlet. My brother Claudius killed me, poisoned me, and is now wedded to your mother. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to get revenge. I want you to get revenge on this bastard. But he says, taint not your mother, but take care of Claudius. All right, so seems fair enough. And if Hamlet had been, say, Othello, he would have come down, killed Claudius, end of play. But that's not Hamlet. Hamlet overthinks everything. And so he thinks, well, is it a true ghost or not? And if it's a ghost, is it authentic? Is it a demon or is it a saint? Should I listen to it or shouldn't I? And aren't we supposed to let God handle these things? Why would I want to do that? Is revenge a Christian act? Then he thinks, well, how will I kill him? Because he's surrounded by guards all the time. And then he has a chance to kill him because Claudius is praying in a chapel and Hamlet comes up behind him and says, I can do it now. He takes out his knife and thinks, wait a minute. If he's praying and I kill him, I'm just sending him to heaven. So I'll wait till he's having sex with my mother or engaged in some kind of gluttony or doing some awful thing, and I'll kill him then. So you think, come on, Hamlet, just do it. But he can't. He can't do it. And he finally does kill Claudius at the end of the play, but sort of accidentally. It all just falls apart at the end. But to get rid of him, Claudius sends him to England. And he sends secret instructions for the English people to kill Hamlet. Hamlet discovers this on the ship going to England, and so he manages to evade that. Then he comes back secretly to Denmark, and he's coming up to the castle. This is going to be trouble because the king wants him dead and certainly didn't expect ever to see him again. And as he's coming up, he comes to the graveyard, and there's a gravedigger digging a grave. Now, what Hamlet doesn't know is that his girlfriend Ophelia, who he's treated abysmally in the play, Ophelia has gone insane, and she was out next to a creek, and she fell into the water and drowned. And so, is it suicide? Probably. Is it an accident? Who knows? But because her death was doubtful in Christian terms, there's been a debate at court about whether she can be buried in a Christian cemetery, because a suicide has to be buried outside of a consecrated ground. So that whole debate has been going on. And finally, Claudius forced them to bury her in the cemetery. But Hamlet doesn't know she's dead, and Hamlet doesn't know that the gravedigger is digging her grave. That will come up after the scene that we're about to portray. So Hamlet comes up, and Hamlet, in all of Shakespeare's many characters, Hamlet is the wittiest by far. He spends all of his time outwitting everyone. Claudius, his mother Gertrude, Polonius, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, you name it. Whenever somebody says something, Hamlet undermines it with wit. That's his defense mechanism, and that's how he's trying to portray himself as having gone insane so that he can sneak around the court and get to Claudius. And so he's the wittiest character in Shakespeare, and he's outwitted absolutely everybody. And now he comes to this graveyard scene, and here's what you're going to love. This common gravedigger out-Hamlets Hamlet. He's wittier than Hamlet, and Hamlet sees this. He comes up, and you'll see that the gravedigger is very funny and very witty, and so Hamlet has met his match. But in a world of very strict social hierarchy, where Hamlet is the very top and the gravedigger is right at the bottom of the scale, the gravedigger, with no education, out-Hamlets Hamlet. So this scene is another one of those existential moments. You'll see it's one of the most extraordinary existential moments in literature. It's also comic. So it's comic and tragic, and it ends, of course, with the famous "Alas, poor Yorick" scene. So instead of just talking about it endlessly, let's do it.
How fare thee? Did you guys not get your scripts? Clay, did you forget to... The man is a Rhodes Scholar. We'll fix it. Never mind. Okay, so here's the deal. I come out, stage right, I cross the center, I go down here, and I say, how fare thee? And you say, well, sir. Okay? Well, sir. Yep, good. So let's try that. All right, I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to say, how fare thee?
Well, sir.
Not bad. Let's try it one more time, and this time a little bit more. Okay? Find those memories deep inside of you that let you say, well, sir, okay? How fare thee?
Well, sir.
Woo-hoo! Is she to be buried in Christian burial that willfully seeks her own salvation? It must be. Say offendendo. It cannot be else. Here lies the water. Good. And yeah, here stands the man. Good. If the man goes through the water and around himself, it is willy-nilly. He goes. Mark you that. But if the water come to him and drown him, he drowns not himself. Argal, he that is not guilty of his own death, shortens not his own life. Great folk should have countenance in this world to hang or drown themselves more than they're even Christian. Come my spade, there is no ancient gentleman, but gardeners, ditchers, and grave makers, they hold up Adam's profession. He was the first to bear arms. Scripture says Adam digged. Could he dig without arms? Cudgel thy brain no more about it, for your dull ass will not mend with beating. But when you are asked this question next, you say, a grave maker. The houses they make last till doomsday. In youth, when I did love me, thought 'twas very sweet to contract time for my behoof, only thought there was nothing meet. But
has this fellow no more feeling for his business, but he sings at grave making?
But age with his steel and step has caught me in his clutch, and has stripped me until the land, as if I'd never been such.
Oh, this skull had a tongue in it and could sing once. Now the knave jowls it to the ground as if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. Or it might be the pate of a politician, which this ass or office is. One that would circumvent God. Or it might be a courtier, which could say, "Good morrow, sweet lord. How dost thou, good lord?" This might be my lord such a one that praised my lord such a one's horse when he meant to beg it. Why, e'en so. And now, my lady Worms, chapless, and knocked about the mazzard with a sexton's spade. Here's fine revolution, if we had the trick to see it. Did these bones cost no more the breeding than to play at loggets with them? Mine own ache to think on it.
A pickaxe and a spade for such a shrouding sheet. A pit of clay for to be made, for such a guest is meet.
There's another. Why may not this be the skull of a lawyer? Where be its quiddits now, his quillets, his cases, his tenures, and his tricks? Why does he allow this rude knave to knock him about the sconce with a dirty shovel and will not tell them of his action of battery? This might be, in his time, a great buyer of lands with his recognizances, his fines, his double vouchers, his recoveries. Is this the fine of his fines? And the recovery of his recoveries have his fine pate filled with fine dirt? Will his vouchers vouch him no more, and double ones too, than the length and breadth of a pair of indentures? The very conveyances of his lands will hardly lie in this box. And is the inheritor entitled to no more? I will speak with this fellow. Whose grave's this, sir?
Mine, sir. A pit of clay for to be made, for such a guest is meet.
I think it is thine indeed, for thou liest in it.
You lie out on it, sir, and therefore it is not yours. For my part, I do not lie in it, and yet it is mine.
Thou do lie in it to be in it, and say 'tis thine. 'Tis for the dead, not for the quick, therefore thou liest.
And 'tis a quick lie, sir, and 'twill away again from me to you.
What man dost thou dig it for?
For no man, sir.
What woman then?
None neither.
Who is to be buried in it?
She that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead.
How absolute the knave is. We must talk by the card, or equivocation will undo us. By the mass, I have noted it these 3 years. The age has become so picked that the toe of the varlet comes so near to the heel of the nobleman that it galls his kibe. How long hast thou been a gravedigger?
Of all the days of the year, I came to it that last day that our King Hamlet or King Fortinbras.
How long is that since?
Can you not tell that? Every fool can tell that. It was the very day that young Hamlet was born, he that was mad and sent into England.
I marry. Why was he sent into England?
What? Because he was mad. He shall recover his wits there, or if he do not, 'tis no great matter there.
Why?
'Twill not be seen in him. There the men are as mad as he.
How came he mad?
Oh, very strangely, they say.
How strangely?
Faith, even losing his wits.
On what ground?
Why, here in Denmark. I have been sexton here, man and boy, 30 years.
Dost thou think Alexander the Great looked of this fashion in the grave?
Even so.
And smelled so too?
Even so.
To what base uses may we return? Why might not imagination trace the noble blood of Alexander the Great till we find him stopping a bunghole?
Bunghole. 'Twere to consider, too curiously to consider so.
No, faith, not a jot. But to follow it thither with modesty enough and the likelihood to lead it as thus. Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander returneth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam. And why of that loam to which he returneth might we not stop a beer barrel? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth that held the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the winter's flaw. How long will a man lie in the earth ere he rot?
Well, if he be not rotten before he die, as we have many pocky courses these days, it'll scarce hold a laying in. He will last you some 8 year or 9 year. A tanner will last you 9 years.
Why he more than another?
Why, sir, his hide is so tanned with his trade, that he will keep out water a great while. And water is a horse indicator of your dead body. Now, here's the skull now. Oh, this skull has lain in the earth 3 and 20 years. Horse and mad fellas it was. Who do you think it was?
I know not.
A pestilence on him for a mad rogue. I poured a flagon of Rhenish on my head once. This same skull, sir? This same skull, sir, is Yorick's skull. The king's jester.
This?
In that.
Let me see it. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him. A fellow of infinite jest and most excellent fancy. He has borne me on his back 1,000 times. And now, how horrid in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar. Not one now to mock your own grinning? Quite chop-fallen? Now get thee to my lady's chamber, and tell her let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. Thank you. So, thank you. What could be more perfectly existential than encountering his old pal, the court jester, as a skull? Oh my, this is one of the supreme moments in the history of literature. It's the equivalent of Michelangelo's David, or the Taj Mahal, or Milton's Paradise Lost. There are so few moments like this in all of literature, Paul. And this scene, I think, is even greater than the tomorrow speech at the end of Macbeth, but they belong to the same absurdist existential theater of the absurd energy that Shakespeare somehow found 400 years before absurdist theater even began.
I just like playing the gravedigger.
You had a little trouble with your microphone there, my friend.
The mic should get its own set of applause, I think.
Yes. Oh, well done. So now, we've done it. This was our program. But we have time for some questions, if people have questions. I want to thank you for coming all the way from Norfolk, Virginia. I know you've just resigned as the director of the TCC Roper Theater there. Retired.
I quit.
You quit. But you're not done yet. You've got a lot of acting still in you.
Hope so. Yes. Well,
this is it's my passion. And now that I've passed, the working 60-hour part of my career, my goal is just to make good theater in whatever way I can.
So I want to ask you a little bit about this set. So when we first did this in Norfolk, I think 5 or so years ago, you designed this set so that it could travel. So tell us about that.
This, what I call the patented grave in a box, was built by a wonderful man, Lee Smith, a master props maker, just what we call a l'homme de théâtre, a guy that could do everything. Unfortunately, he recently left us. His wife, Catherine, directed the show and adapted it. And I'm sorry she didn't get in the program, but they're both wonderful people. I see Catherine a lot, and we owe a lot to them for how the show came about.
So it was designed to travel. I'm sure TSA loves it.
The crate that it goes in is built to a millimeter of UPS's limits on ground freight, and it weighs about 1 pound less than they allow that way. So
So I think there's some microphones out here. If you have questions or comments or anything you'd like to say, we'd be very glad to hear them. Who would like to speak?
Yeah, so we've got Megan on that side of the house, and I'm over here. We'll bring the mic to you. Just raise your hand. And before we jump into questions, one more round of applause, please, for Paul Lassico.
For Paul.
And Clay Jenkinson. Megan, you've got one there? Go for it.
We do.
Hey, you mentioned you knew some background on Shakespeare, that he was a worker in the theater and just was writing on his own and didn't really have an education. And what's known about his psychology? Like, was he on the spectrum? What made him so prolific for such a burst of time, and then just walk away from it and not care about his stuff?
It's a great question. It's so 21st century too. Was he on the spectrum, and if so, where? Does genius always have to be on some spectrum or other? Yeah, of course. My own view is all art is compensatory. I don't know about yours, but at any rate, so I wouldn't say Shakespeare was badly educated. He had a grammar school education, which was heavy in Latin and heavy in memorization and heavy in Aristotelian rhetoric. And he would probably be better educated than a college graduate at CU Boulder or Colorado College or Yale, for that matter. So he had a pretty good education for the times. He didn't go to university, and that may have saved him. Because if he went to university, he might have gotten caught up in the whole formality of ancient theater and so on. Nobody knows what this means, because he talks about the law. He wasn't a lawyer. He talks about falconry, the raptors and the ancient art of falconry. He wasn't a nobleman. He talks about medicine, has no medical background of any sort. He talks about theology. And so that's what leads a lot of people to think, well, he couldn't have been Shakespeare. He must have been Francis Bacon, or he must have been Queen Elizabeth, or he must have been somebody, because that somebody must have been more interesting than some guy from a small town in Stratford. But as far as we know, he just was a genius. And, a genius is a black swan. They're born every long period of time, and if they get the right inducements in life, they express that genius. But we almost know nothing about him. We have 8 of his signatures. He never spelled his name the same way twice. He was involved in a lot of lawsuits, but that was an age when lawsuits were just as common as a Rotary Club is in our time. We don't know much about him. We know he was married. He married a woman who was 8 years older than he was. He had 3 children. He was a very successful businessman. He was separated from his wife for very long periods of time. There's some sense in which the marriage might not have been that happy. She was in Stratford. When he died, in his famous will, he left her his second best bed, whatever that means. And there are, believe me, conferences and whole panels talk about this endlessly. Nobody quite knows. But he died as a kind of a successful businessman and walked away from the theater just because he had the wealth to do it and was seeking some leisure. We don't know whether he was Catholic or Protestant. This was the moment when that whole craziness was going on. We don't know anything about Shakespeare. We know this. He didn't like dogs because in his plays he's consistently awful about dogs. And that's about it. That's about what we know about this man. And so that's, in a sense, that's great, isn't it? Because he's like a blank, and we have to find our meaning not in his life or in his relationships or with his parent and children. We have to find the meaning in the text itself.
All we know is these wonderful words are...
Microphone.
All we know is these wonderful words are on pages for us to interpret, for us to use, for us to love. How they came about, like I said, I don't care. Marley may have written the whole canon, fine with me, I don't really care, because the text represents itself.
But something, what we've been trying to emphasize tonight, and the whole theme of my own work on Shakespeare, is that whatever he was able to get into the depths of what it is to be in love, what it is to be jealous, what it is to hate, what it is to suddenly have religious doubts, what it means to go through betrayal, what it means to aspire to greatness, what it means to be a regicide, to kill a king. Somehow he was able to bore into the very depths of human nature, and that happens from time to time. but then he was able to lift it into the highest poetry in the English language, and it's that gap between deep psychological penetration. And by the way, no one of his era ever wrote about women as successfully and as usefully as Shakespeare did. Some of his female characters are amongst the most cherished characters in literature. Cleopatra, Desdemona, Viola in Twelfth Night, Rosalind in As You Like It, Gertrude and Ophelia in Hamlet. So he understood how to sort of get in, to a certain degree at least, into the souls of women too. And no other playwright of his time has anything like that capacity. So it's a mystery. And the mystery forces us away from thinking about him, the man, into thinking about the words that he left on paper.
What do you two think about modern adaptations, like changing settings, ages, gender bending, and do you think it fulfills the duty to Shakespeare that you're talking about?
Oh, I certainly do.
I certainly don't.
As far as I'm concerned, when an artist signs the last page, or signs the painting, or puts the last dot on a sheet of music, the work now belongs to the world. It doesn't belong to the artist anymore. There's such richness in this text, and so much about it applies to our modern lives, that how could you not want to shift time periods? How could you not want to use modern dress to use the text to explain modern times?
No, so I hear you, and of course you're right that the moment that the piece of art leaves the artist's hand, it belongs to the universe, it belongs to the world, and every age will reinterpret. For example, As You Like It is a very hot play now because it talks about gender and gender construction. And remember, every female character in all of Shakespeare's plays was performed by a boy, by a pre-adolescent boy. So Cleopatra was portrayed by a boy, Gertrude by a boy, Rosalind by a boy. It kind of blows your mind. But if you've ever seen a good play in which boys portray all the characters in Shakespeare, Mark Rylance did a world-class performance as Viola in Twelfth Night. Coleridge said that when we go to a play, even though you bought your costume at Walmart, that in the audience there's a willing suspension of disbelief. That there's a willing suspension of disbelief. For a moment we think you're the gravedigger. For a moment maybe we think I'm Hamlet. And this is the magic of the word and the magic of theater. But when I go to see a play and it's sort of set in a concentration camp or it's set in a target in Hollywood, I groan. I groan because I think, can't we just let Shakespeare be Shakespeare? Can't we just let it be? But I know you're going to say that's a mistake.
We don't know how Shakespeare did his plays. We weren't there. So trying to do it in a kind of classical style with Elizabethan costumes, that's great. Nothing wrong with it. But we don't dishonor Shakespeare by doing it differently. We don't honor Shakespeare by doing it what would be considered very conventionally. We just don't know how they did it. That's my ideas. But it's the artist's job to take work and push it further.
And the market will decide. So
indeed it will.
If you do a production of King Lear and you do it in a really strange sort of way, if it's set on a farm in South Dakota in 1932, well, not so interesting because remember Jane Smiley wrote a novel, 1,000 Acres, based on the very plot of King Lear. That one was set in Iowa. But when you go to see that, as long as it delivers the meaning, then it's okay. But sometimes you will agree that the modernization of costuming and the modernization of so on can get in the way of it too. There's a kind of a mannerist, almost a perverse interest in being different.
Well, we'll say this. I saw a production of Midsummer Night's Dream by the Guthrie Theater, I think.
In Minneapolis.
They were on tour, but they performed the entire thing on an enormous jungle gym.
No.
Yes.
No.
It was interesting, but no, I didn't think it worked. But I applaud them for trying.
Gee, what could go wrong?
We're a couple minutes over time, but we're going to take one last question.
Oh,
here.
dear,
Thanks
we're
for
over time.
bearing with us.
So, Clay,
Yes, sir.
the point of what we did tonight was to make this accessible. So I would say when you modernize a play and you make it accessible to an audience that says, Shakespeare, I don't want to see Shakespeare, but they may come because it's set in modern times or whatever, then I think, what's wrong with that?
I'm obviously in a minority of one here. So I'm not going to fight you. You know, you have a huge background in theater. You have an authentic background in theater. I get it, and I understand it, and I'm okay, but I still groan. I still groan when I see this happen, and I want, for me, Shakespeare is language. And you'll remember his stage was not like this. It's a proscenium arch. His stage was deep. There were no curtains. There were no props to speak of. When one character was coming the way James is in that door, Hamlet was walking out this door. And it's just like that. It just goes in that rapid fire. And the costumes were very rudimentary, and they were often completely off. So you have Roman characters and Julius Caesar looking like they just came out of the Jacobean court in London. And you know what? Everyone got it, because you suspend your disbelief, and it's the language, the language, the language, the language, and it carries everything. And so I've seen it done in bare bones, and I've seen it done set in Nazi Germany or Afghanistan. There's a brilliant King Lear by Anthony Hopkins, which I absolutely adore, and it's kind of set in Afghanistan in our time. Yes, I get all that, and I accept that, and I don't want to be seen as that guy, you know, the purist. But I do think that oftentimes these things are distracting, and there is a certain sense, well, we're not going to do it the way they did it. We're going to do it the way we want to do it. And most of the time when I go to those plays, and I will tell you, Chris, I'm a generous playgoer. I just want to get into it. Most times I come away thinking, yeah, it cost more than it gave us. That was, the director, I think, should have brought that down a little. But this is a debate that will go on for the rest of time, of course. We've done this sort of in period, although you did have, was that just in rehearsal? You had that can of oxygen earlier today? Because he's from Norfolk.
I live at sea level, so I needed that huff of oxygen very badly, and luckily it works.
Oh yeah, it came out tonight.
Yeah.
It's been such a pleasure, really, to be here. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Lassico and Clay Jenkinson. Clay, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the audience believes in you. Thank you.
Go read Shakespeare. Go read Shakespeare.